Hi guys, hold up. Don't click away yet, and make sure you're sitting tight because what I'm about to break down for you today isn't some run-of-the-mill trade spat you've scroll past on the news, and it definitely not one of those diplomatic shouting matches that fades away after a few days. This is the kind of thing that can rewrite the entire landscape of North America and maybe even shake up the global order as we know it. You need to stick around until the end. Trust me. By the time we're done, you've realized we're all watching something historic unfold, a 175-year-old peace alliance slowly crumbling all because of one ridiculous, ill-informed statement that being repeated like it be the truth. I don't know if you've seen Trump in recent rallies or speeches lately, but when I first heard that line I had to rewind the clip 3 times just to make sure I was mishearing it. I was genuinely stunned, like mouth agape, can believe what I'm hearing stunned. Here former US president, standing on a global stage talking about the longest undefended border in the world, T1 between us and Canada, and acting like it no big deal. 175 years, guys. 175 years of no wars, no conflicts, no troops staring each other down across the line. We've been like next-door neighbors who borrow a cup of sugar, help each other fix the fence, and have each other backs when times get tough. Canada is just an ally. They're our closest ally bar none. There are no other country on this planet that done stood with us through thick and thin the way Canada has, from World War I to 9/11 and everything in between. But Trump, he stood up in front of millions of people and casually dropped this bombshell. Canada is totally dependent on the United States, and we don't depend on Canada at all. Let me say this again, loud and clear, so there, no confusion. This what's the slip of the tongue, was a momentary lapse in judgment, and it was some out-of-punching clip the media edited to make him look bad. This was intentional. He said it over and over again. In multiple speeches, in interviews, even on social media, he built an entire narrative around it, going so far as to say that if Canada became the 51st state, America would be greater than ever before. Can you even wrap your head around that? A former president of the most powerful country in the world, publicly calling for the annexation of our closest ally, treating a sovereign nation like it's just another piece of real estate he can buy up and flip for a profit. It not just disrespectful, it a complete violation of everything we claim to stand for in international relations. It like he never even heard of the concept of national sovereignty, let alone respected it. But here, the scariest part, all the mainstream media headlines are fixated on the clickbait stuff. Nay, Annex Canada sound bites. The trade deficit arguments, the petty insults traded between politicians. Nobody dean stopping to explain the real story, the one that matters most, the basic economic reality that Trump is completely ignoring that line. We don't depend on Canada. I'm not exaggerating when I say it might be the most economically illiterate statement me as president has ever made. Today, I'm not here to take sides, no Democrat bashing. I'm just here to lay out the facts, the data, and the real-world consequences of ignoring both. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how dangerous it is when a superpower chooses arrogance and ignorance over reason and common sense, when we turn our backs on the supply chain math that keeps our economy running just to score political points. Let this start with energy, because energy is where the fantasy of American mineral energy independence crashes head-on into reality, and at the first place we can debunk Trump and lie once and for all. You probably heard politicians from both parties brag about how America is energy independent now, how we don't need to rely on any other country for oil or gas. Let me ask you this, if that's true, then why do we import more energy from Canada than from any other country on Earth? Spoiler alert, it's not true, not even close. And when you look at the numbers, the idea of energy independence without Canada becomes laughable. So if it weren't so terrifying, let me hit you with some hard numbers that Trump and his team don't want you to see. How much Canadian crude oil crosses the border into the US every single day? It is not hundreds of thousands of barrels, it not millions. It 4.1 million barrels per Dalton Y. Let that sink in. 4,100,000 barrels every single day flowing south from Canada to the US, that more than we import from Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, and Kuwait combined. In fact, Canada supplies 63% of all the crude oil we import here in the US. Think about that. For every 10 barrels of foreign oil we use, more than 6 of them come from our neighbor to the north. Not a minor dependency, that lifeline. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. So what, we can just find another country to buy oil from, right? We just replace Canada with someone else. If that's in your first thought, you're not alone. You're also completely wrong, and that's not a knock on you. Did a knock on how little our politicians talk about the actual mechanics of our energy system. You see, the problem isn't just that we import a lot of oil from Canada, yin that we import a very specific type of oil that no other country can reliably supply in the quantities we need. Let me break this down for you because it's crucial to understanding why Canada is irreplaceable. Most of the refineries in the US, especially the massive ones along the Gulf Coast, aren't designed to process just any oil. They purpose built to handle heavy, sour, crude oils tea kind that comes from Canada oil sands in Alberta. This oil is dense, high in sulfur, that's what poor means. With an API gravity of around 20 degrees, the lower the number, the heavier the oil. By contrast, the shale oil we produce here in the U.S. seen places like the Permian Basin in Texas or Eagle Ford in South Texas, light, sweet crude with an API gravity of 40 to 50 degrees and almost no sulfur. These are two completely different products, and they can be used interchangeably in most refineries. The Gulf Coast refineries have specialized equipment, like delayed coking units and hydrocracking plants that are specifically designed to break down that heavy Canadian crude into usable products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. If you put light U.S. shale oil into those refineries, they'd either shut down entirely or produce far less fuel at a much higher cost. It's like trying to put diesel fuel into a gasoline car. You can do it, but it'd be going to break everything, so why don't we just refit those refineries to process our own shale oil? Great question, and the answer is simple. It's impossible to do quickly, and it would cost billions of dollars with catastrophic consequences for our energy supply. Those Gulf Coast refineries took decades to build, with tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment. Every pipe, every piece of equipment, every step in the production process is tailored to the heavy Canadian crude. To refit them to handle light shale oil would require shutting them down for years during which we do have no way to produce enough gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel to meet U.S. demand. Gas prices would skyrocket overnight, transportation would grind to a halt, and our economy would collapse. It's not an exaggeration. Tune in basic engineering and economics. But even if we could refit the refineries, which we can't not anytime soon, we still could replace Canada or Alia, because Canada is the only reliable source of heavy crude oil in the world. Let me give you some context here. Canada and Venezuela together control more than 80% of the world in oil sands and extra heavy oil reserves. But Venezuela is a disaster, plagued by political instability, economic collapse, and a lack of investment in infrastructure and technology. Their oil production has plummeted from 3 million barrels per Dalton Y a decade ago to less than 700,000 today, and is not coming back anytime soon. Canada, on the other hand, has a stable political system, advanced extraction technology, like steam-assisted gravity drainage, which allows us to extract oil from the sands without destroying the environment, a vast network of pipelines, and a mature market system. They are the global leader in oil sands production, and they're only getting better at it. Canada's oil sands reserves are concentrated in three major areas in northern Alberta: the Athabasca, Cold Lake, and Peace River oil sands. The proven economically recoverable reserves are a staggering 1.6 trillion barrels of oil equivalent, 98% of Canada, and total oil reserves, and the fourth largest in the world. To put that in perspective, that are more oil than Saudi Arabia has, and the best part, it is sustainable. Let's take two examples. Canadian Natural Resources, CNQ, one of the biggest oil sands producers, has proven reserves of around 20 billion barrels at their current production rate, that enough to supply us for 44 years. Meiji Energy, another major player, has a reserve-to-production ratio of nearly 50 years. That means Canada can supply us with the heavy crude we need for decades, consistently, reliably, and without the GLD risks that come with importing from the Middle East or Venezuela. Palenque that to our other options. Mexico gun oil production has been declining for years. They now a net importer of oil, so they can help us. The Middle East has some heavy crude, but importing from there means dealing with long shipping routes, which take weeks, not hours, like Canadian oil. Sky-high transportation cost and constant geopolitical instability. Let Burkay real. The Middle East is a powder keg. One missile strike on a pipeline, one political uprising, one trade embargo, and our oil supply is cut off. We saw that in 1973 with the OPEC oil embargo, and we've seen it time and time again since then. Canada, by contrast, has been a stable supplier for 175 years. They don't cut us off when they're a chank. They don't raise prices to punish us. They just keep the oil flowing. They're no comparison. Not even close. So when Trump says, "But we don't depend on Canada," what he really saying is that we can replace 4.1 million barrels of heavy crude oil per Dalton Y overnight without disrupting our refineries. without raising gas prices, and without putting our economy at risk. Dan, not confidence that tad willful ignorance, ignoring the basic facts of how our energy system works, and it putting every American way of life at risk. But energy is just the tip of the iceberg. Our dependency on Canada goes far beyond oil, and even more critical when it comes to natural gas and electricity, two things that every single American relies on every single day. Let's talk about natural gas first. How much of the natural gas we import comes from Canada? 98%. 98%. That is almost every single cubic foot of imported natural gas we use here in the US. Think about what that means for your daily life. When the temperature drops to 20 below zero in the Midwest in January, what keeps your house warm? Canadian natural gas flowing through pipelines that crisscross the border? When you turn on your lights in the Northeast, when factories in Pennsylvania fire up their machines, when hospitals keep their life-saving equipment running, they are using Canadian natural gas. We have dozens of major natural gas pipelines connecting the US and Canada built over decades of cooperation, with billions of dollars in joint investment. These pipelines aren't something we can replace with a snap of our fingers, and they aren't something Trump can undo with an executive order. They permanent infrastructure, critical to our daily survival. Let me give you a real-life example of just how important this is. Back in the winter of 2024, the US Midwest was hit with a historic cold snap. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit in places like Minnesota and North Dakota, so cold that power lines were freezing, roads were impassable, and US natural gas production ground to a halt. Our domestic supply could keep up with demand, and we were on the verge of a massive heating crisis. Thousands of families were at risk of freezing, hospitals were preparing to shut down, and factories were already closing their doors. But then Canada stepped in. They increased natural gas shipments through existing pipelines by 30%, pouring in the fuel we needed to keep the heat on and the lights on. Without that Canadian gas, we would have seen widespread blackouts, hypothermia deaths, and an economic disaster that would have cost billions of dollars. Dan, not speculation, the dad exactly what would have happened. And it's not the first time Canada has bailed us out every winter when demand spikes. We rely on Canada to keep us warm. Every summer when we need more electricity for air conditioning, we rely on Canada. This isn't a banner ship that keeps us alive. Let's talk about electricity, another area where we're even more dependent on Canada. Canada supplies 82% of all the electricity we import. 82%. For states like New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and Vermont, that number is even higher. Some of these states get more than 50% of their total electricity from Canada. You might think that just a buy nice to have supplement, that they could get by without it if they had to. But you'd be wrong. These states rely on Canadian electricity to meet peak demand, like when everyone turns on their air conditioners in July, or their heaters in January. Without Canadian electricity, they face massive blackouts every single year. Let's take New York City as an example. In the summer, when temperatures hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity is through the roof, New York own power plants can keep up with the demand for air conditioning. If it weren't for the electricity coming from Quebec black hydroelectric dams, New York City would have rolling blackouts every week. Offices would close, subways would stop running, grocery stores would lose millions of dollars in spoiled food, and people would be stuck in their apartments without AC and sweltering heat. That not a hypothetical, that and the reality of what would happen if we lost Canadian electricity. About keeping the lights on, kinning about keeping costs down. Canadian electricity is some of the cheapest and cleanest in the world, thanks to their massive hydroelectric infrastructure. Quebec alone has more than 60 hydroelectric dams producing electricity at a fraction of the cost of US coal or natural gas plants. That cheap electricity helps American businesses keep their costs low, which means lower prices for consumers. That helps families save money on their monthly electric bills, money they can use to pay rent, buy groceries, or save for the future. If we cut ties with Canada and tried to replace that electricity with domestic sources, our electric bills would skyrocket by 30%, 40%, maybe even 50%. And who would pay that price? You, the American consumer. Not Trump, not the politicians in Washington. Let's put this all in perspective in 2024. The total value of energy trade between the US and Canada was $151 billion. That not a trade imbalance that tan a mutually beneficial partner Bernader. American business uteni and Iberiety. When Trump says, but we don't depend on Canada, he really saying we don't need 63% of our imported oil, 98% of our imported natural gas, or 82% of our imported electricity. He's saying we don't need working refineries, warm homes in the winter, stable electricity in the summer, or low energy prices. Not just absurd, due to reckless, it ignoring the basic needs of every American and it ignoring the foundation of our economy. But like I said, energy is just the start. Let B move on to trade, because the numbers here are even more shocking, and they make Trump lie even more obvious. You probably didn't know this, but Canada is the largest destination for U.S. exports. Not China, not Mexico, not Germany, Canada. In 2024, U.S. businesses exported $350 billion worth of goods to Canada. Let that sink in. $350 billion, that billions of dollars in sales for American manufacturers, farmers, and entrepreneurs. It's millions of American jobs that depend on Canadian consumers buying our products at the same time. We imported $413 billion worth of goods from Canada, which means we have a goods trade deficit of around $62 billion, and Trump loves to talk about that deficit. He acts like it proof that Canada is taking advantage of us, like we ain't getting ripped off in this relationship. Here's the thing. That a completely misleading way to look at trade. Trump treats international trade like a zero-sum game. Like if one country has a surplus, the other has to have a deficit, and the one with the deficit is the loser. But that's not how trade works. Not even close. Trade is about mutual benefit, not winning or losing. And when you look at the full picture, P&O's services trade things look very different. Trump never mentions the services trade surplus we have with Canada. American companies export far more services to Canada than we import. Things like financial services, legal services, tourism, and tech services. When you add that in, we actually have a total trade surplus with Canada between $35 billion and $45 billion, depending on how you calculate it. We're not getting ripped off making money, a lot of money, but even more importantly, half of all trade between the US and Canada is finished products crossing the border. Team parts, raw materials, and intermediate goods that go back and forth multiple times before becoming a finished product. That because our economies are so integrated, so intertwined, that you can even tell where one ends and the other begins. We have a single integrated supply chain that spans both countries and is one of the most efficient and productive in the world. Let me give you the best example of this. The auto industry. If you drive a Chevrolet Silverado, a Ford RAV 150 or a Dodge Ram, that truck was built with parts from both the US and Canada, parts that cross the border multiple times during production. Let's break down a Silverado truck. Step by step, the steel for the frame comes from Ontario, Canada, where Canadian steel mills produce some of the highest quality steel in the world. That steel is shipped to Ohio, where American workers turn it into truck frames. Those frames are then shipped back to Canada, to Ontario or Quebec, where Canadian workers add the engine components and the interior parts. The partially assembled trucks are shipped back to Michigan, where American workers finish the assembly, add the tires and the paint, and get them ready for sale. By the time that truck rolls off the assembly line in Michigan, it didn't cross the US-Canada border at least 3 times. It not an American truck or a bitten Canadian truck. A North American truck. That's though how our auto industry works. Together we rely on Canadian steel, Canadian parts, and Canadian workers to build the cars and trucks that American consumers buy, and Canada relies on us for assembly, for technology, and for access to our market. It is a partnership surely that benefits both countries. This is just true for the auto industry, dune and true for aerospace, electronics, agriculture, and pharmaceuticals too. Let's take aerospace as another example. Boeing, one of America's largest aerospace companies, sources parts from more than 400 Canadian suppliers. Those parts go into everything from commercial jets to military aircraft. Without those Canadian parts, Boeing could build planes and thousands of American workers would lose their jobs. Similarly, Canadian aerospace companies like Bombardier rely on American technology and American markets to sell their products. We've 2 sides of the same coin. You can have one without the other. Let me give you a recent real-world example of how fragile this partnership is. Back in February 2025, the Canadian International Auto Show was held in Toronto. On the surface, everything looked normal. The major US auto brands were there showing off their new models and prices seemed stable, but behind the scenes there was panic. Just a few months earlier, in January 2025, Trump had signed an executive order threatening to impose a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Canada. Canada immediately retaliated, announcing they would impose a 25% tariff on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods, signed cars, trucks, and auto parts. Both sides later agreed to a 90-day pause on the tariffs, but the damage was already done. Auto manufacturers on both sides of the border were terrified. Here why. 80% of Canada auto parts and vehicle sales go to the U.S. in 2023. Canada assembled more than 1.5 million cars and trucks, most of which were sold in America. If that 25% tariff had gone into effect, those cars would have become 25% more expensive in the U.S. market, pressing millions of American consumers out of buying them. The U.S. auto industry is just as dependent on Canada. 90% of the aluminum used in U.S. cars comes from Quebec, Canada. There ain't no substitute for that aluminum. Tune lighter, stronger, and more fuel efficient than aluminum from other countries. The Canadian Auto Manufacturers Association warned that if the tariffs were implemented, North American auto production would drop by 30%, trade and millions of manufacturing jobs on both sides of the border would be lost. That, not fear-mongering, tatmat. The Canadian Auto Workers Union even released a report saying that more than 200,000 U.S. auto jobs would be at risk if the tariffs went into effect. And those are good-paying middle-class jobs. It's the kind of jobs Trump claims to care about. The truth is, this dependency is mutual. Yes, Canada is highly dependent on the U.S. market. 76% of Canada total exports go to the U.S., while only 24% go to the rest of the world. That a huge number, and it means Canada economy would struggle without access to our market, but Trump only sees one side of the equation. He sees Canada dependency on us, but he completely ignores our dependency on Canada. We depend on Canada for raw materials like steel and aluminum, for parts and components, for energy, and for access to their market. We not just their biggest customer, more their biggest supplier, and we rely on their economy to keep our own economy running. Canada can just switch to other markets overnight and not have the infrastructure, the trade relationships, or the geographic proximity to replace the U.S. market quickly. Shipping goods from Canada to Europe or Asia takes weeks, costs a fortune, and requires navigating complex trade barriers. Shipping to the U.S. takes days, if not hours, and costs a fraction of the price. It's not just about convenience. Canada can afford to walk away from the U.S. market, but neither can we. We both stuck together, and that's a good thing. Deem what makes our partnership so strong, but Trump does not see that. He thinks because Canada depends on us, we can do whatever we want, threaten them, bully them, even talk about annexing them, and they'll just roll over. He could be more wrong when you threaten to impose a 25% tariff on your biggest trade partner. You're not just punishing them, you're punishing yourself. You're disrupting your own supply chain, raising costs for your own businesses and making your own consumers pay more, and that's exactly what's happening right now. Watching this tragedy unfold in real time, Trump tariff threats are like an economic earthquake, hitting Canada hard but also shaking the foundations of our own economy. Let's look at the numbers from 2025. After Trump announced the tariff threat in January, Canadian exports to the U.S. dropped by 26% by April. That just 3 months. Not a normal trade adjustment, that a collapse in provinces like Ontario and Alberta, which rely heavily on exports to the U.S. Manufacturing output plummeted. Factories were laying off workers by the thousands, canceling expansion plans and scrambling to find new markets. But those new markets can replace the U.S., not even close. Let me tell you about a company in Alberta that I read about recently. It is an oil sands company that employs 5,000 people, 2,000 in Canada and 3,000 in the U.S. They export most of their oil to the U.S., but after the tariff threat, their exports dropped by 40%. They had to lay off 2,000 workers, 1,200 in Canada and 800 in the U.S. 2,000 American jobs lost. How? Because of a tariff threat that was supposed to protect American workers, and that just one company in Ontario. A small auto parts manufacturer that supplies GM and Ford had to close its doors entirely. They employed 300 people, most of whom lived in Michigan and commuted to work in Canada. When the tariff threat was announced, their U.S. customers stopped ordering parts. Afraid that the 25% tariff would make the parts too expensive, the company could afford to keep the lights on. So they laid off all 300 workers and closed the factory. Those workers, Americans and Canadians alike, now unemployed, struggling to pay their bills, and wondering why their jobs were sacrificed for a political stunt. These stories are happening all across the border, and the mainstream media isn't covering them. They too busy talking about Trump's latest tweet or the latest insult traded between politicians to tell you about the real people being hurt by these policies. But here the most ironic part. The tariffs are hurting Americans just as much as they're hurting. In April 2025, U.S. imports dropped by 20%, to biggest single-month drop since the 2009 financial crisis, and that when excluding the pandemic years, when imports dropped for obvious reasons. Why did imports drop so much? Because when you threaten to impose a 25% tariff on half of your imports, American businesses stop buying, afraid of higher costs. They can find domestic substitutes overnight, so they just stop producing. Supply chains don't reconfigure themselves because a president signs an executive order. They take years to build and they take years to change. American manufacturers that rely on Canadian steel and aluminum are already feeling the pain. The price of Canadian steel in the US has already risen by 15% because of the uncertainty. Those manufacturers have two choices: absorb the higher costs, which eats into their profits and forces them to lay off workers, or pass the costs on to consumers, which raises prices for everyone. You might not feel it yet, but you will. In the next few months, you'd start to see higher prices for cars, appliances, building materials, and even everyday items like canned food and cleaning products. All of these things rely on Canadian raw materials or parts. And when the cost of those materials goes up, the cost of the finished product goes up too. And who pays for that? You, the American consumer. Trump likes to talk about making America great again, but how does making everything more expensive for Americans make us great? How does losing millions of jobs make us great? Knocks it self-destructive, and economists from both parties are saying so. I've read dozens of reports from economists, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, and they all use the same words to describe Trump's tariff policy. Wyman e a non-force air on chronic suicide. Even economists who supported Trump in 2016 and 2020 are speaking out. Larry Kudlow, who served as Trump's top economic advisor, said recently that the tariff threats against Canada are a mistake, and that we need to work with our allies, not against them. Stephen Moore, another conservative economist who advised Trump, called the tariffs reckless and warned that they could push the U.S. into a recession. These aren't liberals bashing Trump. These are his own advisors, his own supporters, telling him he's wrong, but he won't listen. Here, too busy doubling down on his lie that we don't depend on Canada, and the consequences go far beyond economics. We're not just damaging our economy, as of frying the trust that's been built between the U.S. and Canada over 175 years. For the first time in modern history, the Canadian Prime Minister stood in front of his supporters and said that Canadians are living in dark days, and that the country responsible for those dark days is Russia, is China, it's the United States. Think about what that means. Canada has always been our most loyal ally. They've fought with us in every major war since World War I. They've stood by us after 9/11. They've helped us during natural disasters, trusted us with their security, their economy, and their future. But now, their leader is saying they can trust us anymore. That not just a political statement that added death knell for our alliance. It died a sound of 175 years of peace and partnership crumbling, and it not just the Prime Minister. The Canadian people are furious. Let a look at the polls. A 2025 survey by the Angus Reid Institute found that 90% of Canadians oppose being annexed by the US. 90%. In a country as diverse as Canada, where people disagree on everything from healthcare to climate change, 90% agreement is unheard of. That tells you how angry they are. Another poll by Ipsos found that 82% of Canadians would rather become a territory of the British Empire again than become part of the US. Let that sink in. Canadians spent decades fighting for their independence from Britain. They gained full sovereignty in 1982, and now 82% of them would give that up just to avoid being part of the US. That's how much they distrust and dislike Trumper policies. They'd rather go back to being the colony than be absorbed into a country that treats them with such contempt. Canadian nationalism is at an all-time high. You see support Canadian independence rallies all across the country. Consumers are boycotting US products, Ford trucks to Coca-Cola to Apple Kimes. They're buying Canadian-made goods whenever possible, even if they're more expensive. Canadian businesses are rushing to diversify their markets. They're signing trade deals with Europe, Asia, and South America, trying to reduce their reliance on the U.S. They're reconfiguring their supply chains to avoid using U.S. parts and materials. Even Canadian tourists are boycotting the U.S. car trips from Canada to the U.S. or gas prices or the exchange rate, and not because of gas prices or the exchange rate, because Canadians don't want to spend their money in a country that doesn't respect their sovereignty. They don't want to visit a country whose former president calls for annexing theirs. That a boycott rooted in pride, and it hurting U.S. businesses that rely on Canadian tourism, from hotels in Florida to ski resorts in Colorado, and the Canadian government is fighting back. They've already imposed retaliatory tariffs on $10 billion worth of U.S. goods, targeting products from states that voted for Trump, things like soybeans from Iowa, bourbon from Kentucky, and steel from Pennsylvania. They've warned that if the trade war escalates, they'd impose tariffs on another $125 billion worth of U.S. goods. The scariest threat came from the Canadian provinces. Ontario Premier recently said that if the U.S. imposes tariffs, Ontario could cut off electricity supplies to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. They didn't go through with it, but just the fact that they threatened it should terrify you. If Ontario cut off electricity to those states, it would cause massive blackouts. Factories would shut down, hospitals would lose power, homes would be without heat or ACE. The economic damage would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and it did not just Ontario. Alberta has threatened to cut off oil and gas supplies to the US if the tariffs go into effect. That brand not an empty threat. They have the power to do it, and they're angry enough to do it. At first, a lot of people thought Trump or talk about annexing Canada was just a joke. A way to get attention, a way to rally his base, a way to bull the media. But now, it's getting darker. He repeating it more and more rallies and interviews on social media. He not joking. He really believes that the US should annex Canada. He really thinks that Canada's sovereignty is a joke. He really sees Canada as just another piece of property he can take, and the terrifying. Because when a former president of the US talks about annexing a sovereign ally, it sends a message to the entire world. Oh, the US doesn't respect national sovereignty. We don't respect our allies. We'd use our power to take whatever we want, and the international community is paying attention. Foreign policy experts, neutral ones, not partisan hacks, starting to draw comparisons between Trump comments about Canada and Putin comments about Ukraine before the invasion.